It's been 33 years since the all-encompassing Americans with Disabilities Act passed to remove discrimination towards people with disability. Crystal Quao explores some of its successes as well as areas that need progress.
Kyle Erickson, research associate with North Dakota Center for Persons with Disabilities, says he'd like to start a project related to the state's sub-minimum wage law.
I'm putting together a paper exploring, the pros and the cons of this practice and just whether or not it adds to success for people with disabilities.
Erickson says he knows people who work for as much as $3 an hour, a wage that can be legalized only by the Labor Commissioner after they've investigated the employer's finances and the person's output, among other factors. Emily Schumann, the director for the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, says the legislation has improved the ability for many to navigate in and out of buildings. She says their centers are doing research on interpersonal matters.
You can have an accessible facility that's, perfect, but if the people inside the facility, aren't aware of how to treat and work with those with disabilities, it really doesn't have as great of an impact.
Kenzie Larson, peer support specialist with Independence Inc., says she manages her PTSD with a variety of grounding techniques throughout the day, which her employer supports by allowing her to take a minute when she needs it.
Given the opportunity to shine, so many people will rise to the occasion and be able to display their strengths. We just have to be given the chance to be accepted for exactly who we are.
Erickson says he appreciates being able to transport himself on sidewalks and even places like restaurants that have added accommodations, and is glad some have stayed post-pandemic.
COVID helped out a lot with that because a lot of businesses put in electric openers so they won't have to sterilize their door handles.
Schumann says reasonable accommodations for qualified employees are a right.
Whether that's, working remotely from home or being able to take regular breaks or, being able to use headphones.
She says it looks different for each person. In Minot, I'm Crystal Quao reporting for your news leader.
The Department of Labor released a finding that nearly half of workplace accommodations don't cost money. The report found that the average expense is $300. We'll have details on the findings in this story on our website.